Okay, well, welcome everybody. We're so excited that you could be here today. Speaking with us today is Dr. Jeff Min, who is a clinical development director over at GSK. He's going to talk to us about his transition into that role. And our moderator is going to be Miriam Hussein. So if you have questions during the talk, please pop them in the question and answer box, and we will get to them during our question and answer session. Dr. Min, please take it away.
All right, so appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about a career in clinical development. Just in terms of relevant disclosures, it's obvious that I'm a full-time employee of GSK and receive compensation as an employee. Um, so it's a 90-minute session, so I wanted to just give an overview of the agenda here. Um, a couple of disclaimers. I think these are my personal views. There's no one path or a right path for people. And then also just for you to consider that, this is my perspective, and my perspective is through joining a large pharma company in late stage clinical development. And so, if you decide that a career in industry is for you, your experience might be different if you join a smaller company, if you're in early stage, what have you. And so it's something that I'm going to say right now and continue to say throughout the discussion, which is to ask around to people who have been in industry, um, because we have various different perspectives, and people are usually I found very happy to share their experiences, both good and bad. And in particular, I think people tend to move jobs as well a little bit more frequently in industry than compared to academia. And so, those types of conversations can be really helpful if you ask people why they moved to different companies and why they decided to do so. And then as a last thing, I just want to say that industry loves to use acronyms, and I've tried to remove them from my presentation. But if I do say an acronym that you don't understand, please let me know in the chat and I will try to clarify things. Um, so to just start, just give everyone an overview of my path to industry. I was a fellow, PCCM fellow at University of Pennsylvania. I was doing the clinical research track and did a T32. Um, and also a master's in clinical epidemiology during my training. I was focused on studying the effect of obesity in pulmonary arterial hypertension, and was working towards writing an F32. I had that award notice in 2021, and started the F32 in beginning of 2022. Obviously, I think there were a lot of external factors that were going on during this time, COVID being very prominent. I was also a new father at the time. My son was born in April of 2020. And there was a lot of things going on at home too. So my spouse is also a physician. She's an oncologist and was going through kind of a similar academic path. And so we had a lot of various considerations during this time. And we both went on a job search um, around, through 2021 to 2022. And around that time, I was also in the process of kind of thinking about what my aims for my K grant would be, and thinking about where that would look. Um, Ultimately, I enjoyed the research. I found that writing the K was, to me, a bit isolating. Um, and in terms of the job search, it was actually quite challenging for my wife and I to find suitable academic careers that kind of paired up nicely with each other. So, for all of those different factors, I started to look sort of beyond the typical academic pathway. And I ended up joining GSK in the beginning of 2022, where I have been since. Uh, and then I also took on a role as at Lahey Clinic. So I moved from Philadelphia to Boston, and I started to have a general pulmonary clinic just to keep up with my clinical practice. So that's kind of what I spend most of my day now, is 90% of the time working for GSK. And then I have two afternoon clinics a month with General Pulmonary Clinic, as well as some time with precepting for the pulmonary fellows there. In terms of my time at GSK, I started out working as a medical monitor for several studies. So the medical monitor is basically the medical expert uh, for the sponsor or the company conducting the studies. I joined a study that was called Matinee, which was a phase 3 study of mepolizumab in COPD with elevated eosinophils. Was also assigned as a medical monitor for a number of smaller studies, healthy volunteer studies, etc. Um, and I continued with Matinee throughout its end of study activities. So, writing the study report, the manuscript, as well as taking on some responsibilities uh, for the regulatory submissions for mepolizumab or Nucala. So that's currently, taking up about half of my time working on regulatory submissions. So we have approval in the US. We're working on uh, approvals in Europe and China and other countries globally. And additionally, I was tasked with helping with the design of additional phase 3 studies in COPD with a drug called depemokimab, which is a long-acting anti-IL-5 monoclonal antibody, which we were able to start the three phase 3 studies towards the end of this year. Um, I've also been involved in some business development, external collaborations. So that's basically, GSK trying to make decisions on whether or not to invest or buy certain drugs that are developed by smaller companies, and also have served in terms of um, organizing and attending advisory boards that help with the overall strategy for the company. So the first part I wanted to talk about basically is what is my day to day and like what do you actually do? In preparation for this talk, I talked to some of my colleagues, and I think the most common question people ask me is, what do you actually do all day? And so it's a bit of you need a little bit of background first. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just to talk about what industry teams, how those teams work, where physicians fit into those teams, and then I can give you an idea of my day to day. So industry teams typically work in what are called matrix teams. And since this is the critical care assembly, I was thinking the closest analog to this is, you can think of your rounding in the ICU, and this is your kind of multidisciplinary team in the ICU. So just like you would have, as you would be the physician, you would have your trainees. There would be a nurse, an allied health professional, respiratory therapist, pharmacist, etc. Um, we work in big teams in the industry, and we essentially represent each of our lines, as we call them. So, as an example here, if you were working on part of a study as the clinical lead or the medical monitor, you would be working alongside people who represent, clinical operations, for example, who are responsible for the logistics of, getting the studies up and running, and how who's actually going onto the site, how is the drug actually being delivered, how are we maintaining oversight, those sorts of things. There will be representatives from biostatistics, regulatory affairs, safety. There may be you may interact with people from CMC who are responsible for the manufacturing of the drug itself. You may also talk to people from commercial, market access, who are responsible with talking to payers like insurance companies and other entities. So basically, you can think of a matrix team as one big ICU team working together to solve a problem. Um, the key difference, I would say, between an ICU team and a matrix team is matrix teams, I think, tend to be a little bit more flat. So instead of, an ICU team where, ultimately the attending physician, has that accountability, the accountabilities can be a little bit more spread out within the matrix team. So for matters of, patient safety, for example, or overall trial conduct, the clinical lead might be the person who's accountable. Um, the regulatory person might be the kind of lead for other things, similar for biostatistics, safety, et cetera. So that's the closest analogy. Basically, you work with big teams, and there's usually one or more representatives for each of these lines within the teams. And then the other thing to say is, there are people with medical and science backgrounds, of course, but the other key point here is that a lot of these individuals are experts in their line, but they're not medically trained, or some of them might not even be scientifically trained, right? So your commercial lead, for example. So being able to work in a big team, being able to communicate across this large multidisciplinary team is really important in terms of the day-to-day job. So in terms of physician roles in industry, I generally think of them into sort of three broad categories, which are in clinical development, medical affairs, and safety and pharmacovigilance. And this is assuming that essentially you're working for a pharma company or a biotech that's running clinical trials and part of this trial development. There are other roles within what are called contract research organizations that I put down here, where certain companies like Thermo Fisher or IQVIA might get contracted to essentially run studies on behalf of sponsors. Um, and I won't be talking about those sorts of roles, but just to point out that those also exist. Um, so thinking about clinical development, which is what I do, very broadly, clinical development designs and runs clinical trials. You're sort of merging your knowledge of the disease area, your medical expertise, and then your knowledge of trial design to design and facilitate the execution of clinical trials. Depending on the size of the company, that's typically split between early and late phase. So where early is, usually, preclinical to going into first time in human, perhaps phase one, phase 2A, and then late phase um, from phase two onward. That tends to differ depending on the company and how they're set up as well. But in general, you're doing things like writing the protocol. You're responsible for the writing of the ICF, the oversight, and as I mentioned, the medical monitoring. You would be the person who answers any medical questions that the site or the investigator might have in terms of interpreting the protocol. And then once the data come out, you would be responsible for the medical interpretation of the study data and writing the report and all of the other activities if you're submitting that to a health agency, for example. So moving on to medical affairs, uh, medical affairs physicians, they're the ones who sort of bridge the R&D and the commercial arms of the company. And they typically will take over after a drug has been approved, although they are part of the kind of planning and strategy process, typically in late phase development. And broadly, what medical affairs, part of their role is to make sure that the information that is being communicated and is being discussed with the scientific community, the data that's being presented at conferences, all the way to what's being um, communicated by their MSLs to physicians, for example. They ensure that that's accurate and compliant, so scientifically accurate and consistent with the trial data. Uh, Medical affairs also provides a liaison between the company and external stakeholders, and that includes, the experts in the field. They often will communicate with the folks who are in the guideline writing committees to make sure that the company's positions are being represented. And they will often be in discussions with reimbursement entities. So, payer groups, insurance companies, things like that. So when you're at ATS, for example, and seeing the people kind of at the booths, the people who are responsible for doing a lot of the presentations and abstracts, those that typically falls under medical affairs. And then the other key thing that medical affairs does is they will lead any sort of post-approval evidence generation. So that could include things like phase 3B or phase 4 studies, as well as collaborative studies with academia. And so, those of you who have worked with pharma companies will probably know that you typically work with medical affairs individuals from that company. The third role that a physician can have is in safety and pharmacovigilance. Now, uh, you know, I will say there is some overlap with clinical development because, in clinical development, you are responsible for the safety monitoring within the study. But safety and pharmacovigilance typically will have a broader overview that extends beyond a study or even a program. So, you can think of, for example, uh, a particular drug. You may have 3 or 4 uh, studies that support an indication. So we can use COPD, for example. But you may also be studying the drug in other diseases like asthma or nasal polyps. So safety will typically have that broader view of, integrating a lot of the safety data that's coming in from clinical trials, uh, regardless of the disease area that's being studied at. They may also take in data that's reported in either other studies or just reported as part of post-marketing surveillance. So I would say safety has a much broader kind of scope in terms of looking at safety signals for drugs. And they're often the ones that are doing the periodic monitoring and reporting of safety signals. And there are typical requirements on an annual basis to regulators, and that process is led by safety and pharmacovigilance. So, with all of that in mind, what is my actual day to day? And for me, because GSK is a global company with a lot of people who are actually based in the UK or EU, they're typically pretty early starts to my day. The meetings can start as early as 7 a.m. Or even earlier if we're meeting with colleagues in China or Japan. But generally around 7 or 8 o'clock, I'll start my work day. And the first half of the day, there's usually meetings or handling emails that have come in during the European morning work day. Um, as part of my role, there's a lot of preparing and reviewing various documents, either, documents that we are submitting to external health authorities, or, preparing for internal meetings or governance and things like that. So a lot of document review and preparation and slide decks and things like that. Um, Most industry companies now are working on a hybrid schedule, and I suspect that will continue. So I have 2 in-person days a week in an office that's about 20 minutes from where I live, and then the remainder of the days I work from home. Um, there is periodic travel in clinical development, so that would typically involve attending conferences like ATS. Um, it's less travel than medical affairs, where you would often travel to every major conference. Here we tend to be more selective in terms of picking one or at most two, major international conferences, especially if there are other activities going on like advisory boards or things being presented from your study at that conference. Um, we typically attend investigator meetings, which are meetings that are held at the beginning of clinical trials to train the investigator and engage them, and you know um, you know tell them why and how they should be recruiting for our studies. And we hold advisory boards. So this is where we get, external experts in the field and we ask them various questions to help us with, protocol design, for example, or designing a clinical development program. So travel can be a bit variable, and something that I'll touch upon a little bit later is, it can be a little bit less of a lead time than at least certainly I was um, used to in academia. Uh, and so that was a bit jarring. So, for example, um, I was, because of the various interactions that we were having with a health agency, I was possibly going to have to travel with a week notice. That tends to be the exception, but it can happen. And so certainly if you were used to planning travel 3, 4, 5, 6 months in advance, like I was, that was a pretty jarring change for me. And so certainly something to think about, particularly if you have, you know, um, young children or other kind of family needs as well. It is something to certainly think about and also discuss the expectations if you were looking for an industry job. Um, so that's kind of the day to day. Where I wanted to go to next was just to discuss a couple of myths or things that I've heard about industry jobs. And this was I gathered a couple of these questions. These were either questions that I personally thought or colleagues have asked me. And so I was just going to go through each of these and just discuss kind of my thoughts a little bit. Again, purely my perspective. And, you know, I think other people could have different perspectives or experiences as well. But the one common thing I've heard through my training was, well, you really shouldn't think about transitioning the industry because, you should complete your K or your career development award or wait until you're a little bit more experienced before you consider a transition. Um, and I would say that yes and no. What is the whether that's truth. Um, it is true that your level of experience, will dictate where you start in industry. Um, and so for example, if you have the opportunity to get a lot of experience in actually running a trial, so let's say your K is going to be a clinical trial of some sort. It doesn't have to be an interventional one, even just any sort of kind of study where you're having to do a lot of the activities that we do on a daily basis in terms of submitting IRBs, getting informed consent, thinking about database, thinking about how you're going to analyze, design your study, analyze the data. Those are skills that can translate very well into a career in clinical development. Um, in contrast, if you're planning your K on something that's, very esoteric, it may not have as much translatability into clinical development as this advice would lead you to think. And you may end up starting in the exact same place as somebody who's, coming in straight out of training or just a few years after they finish their training. So that's one thing to consider is, you know, what what skills are you developing as part of that career development or as part of that kind of early career activity? Um, the other thing that I think would be very helpful is an opportunity to be, an investigator or a sub-I in clinical trials. And so if you have that opportunity, that's really building a skill set that would be helpful. And I find that, colleagues who have done some of that before transitioning in industry, they can provide a lot of very helpful insights. Um, and bring I think that brings a lot more sway into, your role on these teams in industry because you can say, hey, I was a PI. What you're suggesting is a really bad idea because of X, Y, and Z. No patient's going to agree to this. Things like that. So the answer to this question is, I think consider what you're going to be accomplishing during these stages in your career and whether or not that would translate into some of the skill sets and some of the activities that I described earlier. Uh, Travel, I kind of touched upon it a little bit. It's very highly variable. So, it kind of depends on what projects you're on. But you definitely have to consider that there could be some travel involved. And as I mentioned, it can be on, less warning. So, typically I'll find out that I need to travel somewhere 2 months ahead of time. And it can be sometimes challenging to coordinate. Now that I have a clinic at Leahy as well, I find that I really have to stay on top of my clinic schedule, um, to make sure that I'm, traveling and not having to cancel clinic or, begging my admin to move move full clinic days around. So it is something to consider, um, as well as, availability at home. As I mentioned, I have a young child, and so, um, you know, certain things will work for certain families, and it may or may not work for you, personally. The other thing that I've heard is in terms of autonomy for research ideas. And this quote was an actual quote that somebody sent me that they received. But I think there's a lot of discussion on what, will you be able to do kind of interesting science? And I think that sort of depends on your role and on the company. But I would say that in general, I've found that the people I work with are extremely, similar to academia, very talented, very motivated. A lot of them come from very accomplished academic backgrounds. And then also, a lot of them have had huge impacts in our field. And, you know, they may be kind of like the person working behind the background. So, for example, I've met a number of colleagues who worked on big landmark COPD studies, and you know, throughout their whole career and bring a ton of experience. Um, and so, I don't think it's just sort of some cookie cutter research that's being conducted in industry. Now, and just like academia, industry is a highly competitive environment. And so just like, people are competing for grants, companies are competing to see who's gonna, find the next big thing, who's gonna get finish their studies quicker, who's gonna design a more efficient study, how do we interrogate existing data to select our patients. Um, so I would say there's definitely a lot of sort of interesting ideas in science, just maybe towards a different goal. Um, and I think that sometimes will also speak to, um, how you could effectively direct that. And it comes to thinking about how you can align sort of the research interests with also the company interests. And thinking about, okay, this is where, people who are in commercial are thinking, this is where people who are in medical affairs are thinking. And then you can say, well, I think we should study this, um, because not only is it scientifically interesting, right? It's something we can communicate to, um, let's say, the scientific community. Is something that can be presented about, uh, you know, the pathophysiology or the mechanism of why our drug works. And this will be, it's not only scientifically interesting and advances the field, but it will, help you have a greater presence at conferences. So those are the types of things that you can also do to, if you have a scientific area of interest or an idea, you can kind of get other people's buy-in, to be able to support that in industry. Um, and I'll say, in a way, the currency of industry is similar to academia, where, you know, the the currency of industry is going to be having successful studies and having drugs that are approved, whereas for academia, it's often, especially in somebody who's in early career, is getting papers, published, getting grants um, funded, right? So there is sort of a push that's just sort of in a different direction. Um, in terms of patient care, I think, you do have to be very realistic about the limits of that. So it does depend on the company. There are certain companies I've heard from colleagues where, they are less flexible about continuing patient care. Um, GSK tends to be pretty flexible in terms of allowing physicians to continue to practice if you choose to do so. I will say that it can be challenging to have a significant, clinical footprint. And I think it would be challenging to have that kind of like golden 80/20 split that, we're often looking for in academics um, because of the unpredictability of your schedule. Um, and so most of the colleagues that I know who still are in clinical practice that's typically relegated to outpatient care. And that way you can plan around an afternoon here or there, but it would be, I think, very difficult to plan around, let's say, being in the unit for an entire week because of the various demands in the company. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it would be fairly challenging, and you may have to really think carefully about how to schedule your day around that. Um, the so it sort of depends on the company, but I have actually found that maintaining that clinical footprint has been very helpful. I think it again gives you some credibility when you're having discussions. So given that I work in COPD in my day to day, being able to say, look, I've seen these patients, I just saw these patients in clinic, and here's what they've told me, or this is my experience with this drug. Um, I think that gives you quite a bit of sway. Um, so I definitely recommend trying to keep up with patient care if you do transition to industry. I will say as also an aside in this terms of you won't be a doctor anymore, that you definitely do get more skepticism. Like when you're at a conference, for example, if you say you're from industry, I think people do view you differently. They do view that you're part of the that you're somehow your views is tainted now because you work for a company. So I've personally seen that a few times. So I won't say that that's not gonna ever gonna happen, but um, overall, I think I still feel like I'm a doctor. Um, and then the last thing I just want to talk about is work-life balance. So I think some of my colleagues have said, well, we've heard that it offers better work-life balance. I think generally that is true. So in terms of my, just sort of, week to week, day to day work, I don't work weekends. I rarely check my email, even on the weekends, unless I know that there's a imminent deadline or something, emergent that's happening. Um, so I think for me, that was very important in terms of having protected weekends for my family. Um, Now, I think there's certainly still crunch, um, just like any job, and so it's not quite sort of always rainbows and sunshine. There's often kind of very early, meetings or late meetings, um, and especially if there are major deadlines coming up, you have a study that's about to end. You're preparing for a regulatory submission, for example. There were definitely days that were very long, that started very early. So you know it's not quite a walk in the park, but I think in terms of comparing to I guess full-time clinical practice, I would say that it generally offers better work-life balance. Um, and then, the travel also, I think people can view um, rather having short turnaround times for travel as, whether or not that's negative or positive in terms of their work-life balance as well. And maybe what can be helpful in preparation for the Q&A is if people have heard other, things about industry or myths, if they want to put that into the chat, and then at the Q&A section, we can sort of go through those as well. I don't know if there's any questions at the moment. This is sort of a good time to pause if there are any questions. Marianne, Priscilla, or
No
should I keep going?
questions just yet. I would keep going. I think talk about some of the other things. When you get to the interview section, I have
Yeah.
questions.
Okay. Yep. So the next section is, what is the interview process like? So I'll try to go into some detail here. Um, so again, this is very focused on a large pharma company. This will look very different if you join, let's say, a startup or a biotech, especially a small biotech, where the roles are often, you know, compressed a bit, and there's less of a hierarchy. Um, Typically, a physician that's starting will start at a director or associate director level, and the U.S. starting salary would be around 250 to 280,000, and that's I think probably the low end of the starting salary, and then would go up depending on experience and level of seniority within academia. And so for example, GSK, there's no associate director position, so everyone goes into director. Um, in some companies, you will start at associate director, and then the expectation would be that you would be promoted to director within 1 to 2 years, is what colleagues have told me. And an associate director or director would typically have study level responsibilities. So you may be the medical monitor assigned to one or several studies. You may be the clinical lead for a study. If you're entering with, more industry or clinical trial experience. So moving on up to that, people generally will say 3 to 5 years between director to senior director in terms of promotion. And a senior director would have more program or asset level responsibilities. So now, we're not just overseeing a single clinical trial, we're maybe overseeing a overall package of clinical trials designed for, a regulatory submission and marketing authorization approval. So now you're taking a step back, and you're kind of responsible for running the overall what we call clinical development plan. So that would be, that will include, you know, the package of trials or studies that you will ultimately submit to regulators. You'll be responsible for any interactions with regulatory agencies like the FDA, the EMA, et cetera. Um, and then a senior director, depending on the company, may also have direct reports, meaning you're a manager um, for individuals like a clinical scientist, for example, or a medical monitor. Um, and then beyond that, I have zero experience with, so this is just, what I've seen in terms of our leadership. But, in the executive director or VP role, these are individuals who would have even broader leadership. So now, you know, you're not just responsible for a drug or a program, but you may be responsible for a entire group of drugs within a therapeutic area. Um, uh, so, my boss's boss, David Lipson, for example, he's responsible for all of respiratory. Um, though, additional roles within the company might include things like chairing certain boards. So this is like we have boards where you would present your clinical development program and your protocol. So it's a little bit of like submitting a grant. Um, so unfortunately, you will not get away from having to do things like that. Although you typically work as a big team to submit this. and the governance boards will focus on the scientific validity of that, and then there may be some different governance boards in terms of discussing the financials, how much it's going to cost, things like that. And then, certainly these roles would have managerial responsibilities fairly broadly, and then also things like business development or strategic collaborations. So, fairly large amounts of investment from the company would, an executive director or VP would oversee those sorts of decisions. And then the typical compensation package. So I mentioned previously that the 250 to 280 thousand. That's generally what's called your base pay or your salary. Um, the compensation package for industry is a little bit different um, than in academia. So there are sort of significant additional compensation on top of that typically. And this is very company dependent, but generally there will be a year-end bonus that's expressed as a percent of your base salary. Um, it's typically paid at the end of the fiscal year, in late February, early March, and it'll be adjusted by performance. For most companies, that's not personal performance. That's not like, Jeff did well, so he gets, an extra bonus. It's more based on like your business unit, and other kind of performance metrics, in general. The year-end bonus can be fairly substantial. So for me, when I started out, it was 18% of my base salary. And then now it's around 25%. So do you have an idea of what the year-end bonuses typically will be? And then companies, if they're publicly listed in the stock exchange, will often offer additional compensation in the form of either stock options or RSUs, which are restricted units. So the way those work is they're basically incentivizing you to stay employed with the company. So every year you will get a certain number of shares, um, and but those shares will sit essentially, and you don't officially get them until a certain amount of time has passed and you're still employed. So it's basically to encourage people to remain at the company and not to look for jobs elsewhere, because you essentially lose these RSUs if they have invested. So for example, they may give you, let's say, you know, $30,000 in stock, but you need to be employed for 3 years afterwards in order to access those. And then there's retirement 401k and matching, and that, the amount depends on the company. GSK, I will say, is fairly generous in terms of the 401k matching. So for me, as long as I contribute 4%, they will give 7% of my base salary as matched, in addition to the 4%. So I get 11% matching on my annual base salary in 401k. And then there's the typical kind of health and medical and dental insurance, and then health savings accounts, dependent care FSAs, those sorts of other benefits. In terms of the job search or the interview process, again, I'll emphasize that I think the most important thing is to ask around, ask colleagues who are in industry, um, for a number of reasons. One, as I mentioned, it's because it's such a different job than what we're used to. It's really good to get an idea of what the day-to-day like, what they don't like, different roles, right? So some of them might be in medical affairs or pharmacovigilance, um, and also different types of companies, right? Like biotechs, medium-sized pharma companies. They're all very different. And from my understanding, even the large pharma companies, each of them have very different cultures internally. Um, and then the other important part about asking around is they may be able to give internal referrals for job listings. So in terms of where you find jobs, LinkedIn is a common place in terms of where companies post their jobs, as well as the specific websites. They'll list, the role, um, and also it'll say something like medical director. Yeah, that's typically the type of job role that a physician would be looking for. Um, but the reason it's important to ask around is oftentimes there can be internal referrals. Um, and the internal referrals will often skip a step in HR process. So, for example, if you look at a lot of common entry-level jobs in industry for physician, you will see that um, part of the requirement will say 1 to 2 years of relevant industry experience. And so if you apply to just a posting, you know, and you don't have that experience, you might just get screened out by, like either, well, now it might be screened out by AI, but it used to be a person who, would screen hundreds of resumes and they may just kind of screen out your resume. Whereas if you get an internal referral, it'll usually go to the person who's the hiring manager, who might take a closer look at your resume and may say, well, so and so wasn't in industry, but they've been in academia and they've been a PI in these studies and they have all the relevant experience, and to sort of get your application, um, um, more consideration than just kind of responding on LinkedIn or company postings. Um, the the process can be very quick, meaning the turnarounds can be very fast. And so if you do decide to apply, you could potentially have an interview in a month or 2 months. So it's very different from academic jobs where you're searching 10 months in advance, and going through all of those processes. Um, so generally, an HR person will reach out and then they'll schedule an interview with the hiring manager. And the interview process is most of it is very similar to an academic job search. You'll interview with various people in your group, to discuss what the role will be and your relevant experience. Communication is typically a big uh, factor, and so you'll often be asked to give some sort of chalk talk or presentation. And the goal of this is not to say, oh, so and so did this research and it's such amazing, world-changing research, but it's more of, how do you communicate an idea or concept? And oftentimes you may be asked to give a talk that you've given before, or you may actually be asked to give a talk on a topic that they pick. Um, they're typically pretty short, like 10, 15 minutes presentations. The other part of the interview process that I think is very different from academic job interviews is what are called behavioral interviews. So this is typically done by not a member of the team, but by HR. And there's a fairly specific way that you have to approach these interviews. And so what I advise people to do is you just search like top 20 behavioral interview questions, and get a list of them. And generally it'll be a question like, tell me about a time that you disagreed with someone at work and had to persuade them to change their perspective. So you have to be very prepared to answer this. It's because you don't want to just tell them a story. You want to get very quickly to the point of, this is the skill set, or this is what I brought into the conversation and help me achieve the goal. So you may only say, give 1 or 2 sentences in terms of the background, but then very quickly talk about, okay, and this is the skill set and the techniques I employed in order to, convince this person to see things from my perspective. Um, So it can be helpful to prepare responses for the most common types of behavioral interview questions ahead of time, just so that you can, you're ready to respond to those when they come up. As I mentioned, the whole process can be very quick. If once they've determined that they're interested based on your application or resume, it could be a couple of weeks to schedule interviews, and then typically once you finish the interview process, you will know about an offer within 5 days. So I often tell people, you need to be prepared for that offer call. Um, the last point here is, if you can time the interview so that you're interviewing for multiple positions, it can be very helpful to have competing offers. Um, I personally going in, this felt extremely uncomfortable to me. To be perfectly honest, I tend to not be a confrontational person. I'm probably the last person you want to be at to help you buy a used car. But everyone told me you've got to negotiate. Like this is just, every day. Like you know, they're not taking it personally. This is just business, and you need to go in with strong negotiating positions. So that's something that I will, often echo and tell people is if you can, you know, um, structure or time the interview so that you could potentially have multiple competing offers, do so because it's only in your benefit. Um, Going back to asking people around, like ask people about their starting salary, because you could be asked what you expect to be paid. And in fact, that did come up for me. So be prepared with a number. If, 2 days after the interview that you get a phone call and they say, so how much do you expect to earn in this role? That's very common. Uh, so you want to be as informed as possible ahead of time. And then once, they're giving you the offer, they're going to be fairly interested. And so that opens up negotiation. Um, you know, so things that you can potentially negotiate, and certainly the base salary. Often you can negotiate a signing bonus. If there is required in-person attendance, you may be able to negotiate moving expenses. Uh, so, for example, I negotiated for GSK to pay for me to move from Philly to Boston. So they had a moving company that to come and like pack up all my furniture and things and unpack it with the move. So those are all things that are negotiable. And part of that was because I had multiple offers and I was able to leverage another offer for that. The start date. So depending on why the company is hiring for that position, the start date could be fairly rigid and it could be fairly flexible. So it just sort of depends on the job. So for example, if the company is urgently needing somebody because somebody quit or retired and they are hurting for headcount on a study that's already running, you might not have a lot of um, negotiating room. They may expect a start date that's in 2 weeks or in 4 weeks. If it's a company that's building out headcount for a future project, you may be able to negotiate a longer start date. So that becomes a um, important point. And also, if there are certain uh, restrictions for you, it's good to um, you know, discuss that early in the process. So, for example, if you say, "Hey, based on my commitments or a grant or something like that, I can't start until 3 months from now," that's something that you would want them to know. Um, there are certain other things that you might be able to negotiate as well. So, for example, if you are facing a potential early termination fee for a grant, you may want to know your position on that and what you're potentially liable for, and negotiate for the company to pay that on your behalf. Benefits may or may not be negotiable. So like as I mentioned in the previous slide, some of the bonus structure and things like that. So for GSK, for example, that was all just fixed based on the grade that you are in. So there was no negotiating of that. It just everyone gets the same thing. So that is kind of where the interview process is. Um, Other considerations to think about, and to sort of ask other people in other roles too, is do you want to be in a big pharma company, or do you want to be in a biotech or a startup? Um, what people have told me is that in general, you if you have less experience in industry, you may want to start in a larger company, so either in big pharma or at least a medium sized biotech. And that's just because, there are more layers of support for you to learn on the go. Whereas, let's say if you decided to just join a startup, you may jump in as the medical monitor, but you're also going to be the lead for the study. People are going to be asking you about, oh, what do we, how do we structure our end of phase two conversation with the FDA? People might be asking you about local regulations for informed consent. It may be very easy to kind of get in over your head without the adequate support. So in general, what the advice that I've heard is, start with big pharma or larger biotechs, learn how to do things the right way, and then, if working in a smaller, quicker environment is something that you're interested in, then, you learn the fundamentals, and then you learn where you can be faster or more, nimble, than a large company can do in certain situations. I mentioned about clinical practice. So like thinking about how important is your clinical practice, and does the company allow you to practice, is something that for some people might be a deal breaker, for if you're not allowed to practice. For others, less so. A really big one uh, is mentorship and career development. And I will just emphasize that is just as important as in academia. So you will still need people to be on your side, people you can trust to go to with hard questions, people who are going to you know give you roles that allow you to kind of expand your development. Um, so it's very important during the interview with your manager to understand how, not just what you're going to do for the company, but how they're going to mentor you, because that's part of their role as a manager, how they're going to develop your skills, where they see your career trajectory, um, and, potentially even ask to talk to somebody who's one of their direct reports to kind of get that, just like you would ask, if you were looking for a new mentor, you might ask to talk to one of their mentees. Um, and I think that's particularly important with now, a lot of jobs can be remote or very hybrid, and you could just be working at home. I think it could be very easy to be lost in a big system, right? And you don't want to be kind of, um, you know, be in a position where you're not allowed to, challenge yourself and advance your career, and you just kind of stagnate in a company. So it can still be it's still essential that you have a good mentorship structure that your your manager and your coworkers, and especially the more senior coworkers, are invested in you and your career development. Um, And then there are also transitional programs. So these are almost like additional sort of training type uh, programs that certain companies offer, which are specifically designed to bridge physicians from a career in academia into a career in industry. I just put these two because these are the two that I know about. But again, going back, ask around. I'm sure there are other programs that I'm not aware of. But I know Vertex and Takeda both have these programs. I believe both of them are 1 to 2 years in duration. So you would still, you know, enter and be paid as a associate director or director. But instead of going directly into, let's say, clinical development or joining a project, the way that these are typically designed is you will do, different, almost kind of like you can think of them as rotations. So, for example, for maybe 6 months, you'll work with medical affairs on something, and then you'll transition to something else, and then you'll work with safety for 6 months, and then you'll work with in clinical development for 6 months. So, and they're typically kind of uh, more structured with additional mentorship and didactics as well, with the goal that at the end of the 2 year mark, you will then be ready to be sort of full time in one of the roles in the company. I think there are pluses and minuses to that, right? And certainly it is a much more uh, there's much more deliberate in terms of getting you exposure to various different job roles, and getting some more specific mentorship. Um, I think the downsides could include things like, if the team knows that you're rotating off every 6 months, it might be hard to really have, um, very impactful roles on the teams. So I think if it's more of a, you get a little sample of everything rather than diving very deep into something. So it sort of depends on where you want to get out of it. And then also, it's a bit of a gentleman's agreement that you would then be hired on after 2 years, but I think some people aren't comfortable with that type of ambiguity, shall we say it. So, they some people might be happier to just have a job and then just do the job and not have to think about, oh, in 2 years I might have to look for a different job. So, something to consider, but certainly worth investigating. If you look at those programs, they have certain deadlines in terms of application cycles. So again, ask around, and consider those as well. So that concludes my part of the presentation. So I think now it's time for a Q&A.
Yes.
I think just in closing, I really enjoyed my time. I've had a chance to work with like really great teams. I think it's been a really positive experience. I've had a chance to meet with uh, kind of experts in the field and have discussions that I would have never thought I'd have the chance to do. Especially kind of this, I still feel like I'm very early in my career. Um, I had a chance to correspond and meet with, the FDA, the EMA, and it's been quite fascinating to see, um, to go from somebody as a prescriber, and I guess I would consider a consumer of drugs, to some seeing kind of the approval process and how the sausage is made. I think it's been fascinating to me. I think we were talking, Priscilla, that I still feel like I'm learning every day. Um, so yeah, it's been quite a ride.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think we all learned a lot. We have so many questions, so I'm going to let Miriam start asking all the questions we have for you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Mann. So we'll move on to Q&A session. One of the questions actually you just touched on a little bit. It's about the pathway for more senior physician scientists, like who is considering moving into industry. So how does that transition typically look like? And are there any differences in expectations or entry points compared with early career clinicians?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly yes. The I can't say that I've had a ton of experience with that, but I think that the assumption would be that you would enter in, you know, I think if you have an area of expertise and um, you would presumably be hired partly for that expertise, and so I think the expectation would be then that you would take a more leading role in that area. That would be my, you know, my assumption of where that would be.
Okay.
Um, and my understanding is typically these are, you know, they're not going to be kind of fairly like random um, job offers. It may be like company really wants to develop a drug in this, and you happen to be the expert in this, and they, that's where sort of the conversation gets started.
No, okay. Is there like a pathway for that?
I think it's a less, I think it's less well laid out in terms of pathway. I mean, I think certainly there is a pathway for that.
Okay, thank you. Another question is in relates to basic, anyone who is in doing basic or translational PhD.
Mhm.
So for those who are not clinicians to like work in this area, how can they get involved in industry or these roles?
Um, yes. So you're saying not like MD PhDs, but PhDs.
PhDs, like yeah,
Yeah.
basic or
Yeah.
translational PhD
Yeah.
scientists. Like what
I
type
mean,
of positions or skill set that can align and how can they get involved?
yeah, I mean, I think certainly more in early development, there are, there are a lot of roles in terms of for PhDs and sort of understanding basic biology, translational research, drug discovery. I think that that's fairly clear. The other group that for me I work with more closely because I'm more in the later stage. So, there's often a translational medicine lead, or formally we call them biomarker lead. I think that kind of undersells the position a little bit, but we work very closely with them in terms of, developing the, aspects of our studies to either develop further understanding of disease biology or how the drug works to inform future studies. It could also be to help with scientific messaging, right? So we may want to have certain objectives for a drug. Like, for example, a common example would be in COPD. You may want to have a CT imaging sub-study, for example, right? And you would work with, somebody who's an imaging scientist, who's a PhD, to help design that part of the study so that afterwards you can show, let's say, a reduction in mucus, and that's been a very common topic in COPD lately. So those are typically roles in scientists that we work with. Um, and then clinical scientists is another role. So those are typically people with like a scientific background who help with the study execution and protocol writing. Um, so oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, we do. We work closely with a clinical scientist, and clinical scientist is responsible for the non-medical parts of the protocol, and then the medical person will provide input in terms of anything that requires a physician to interpret.
Okay, thank you. And how can they get involved? Like, is there a pathway for them as well?
I believe there are for PhD or postdocs, there are often kind of these like some like training programs that companies have. So I would look into that and see if there's any collaborations. Um, that's
Okay.
probably the easiest path, not easiest, I guess, most clear path.
Okay, thank you. And then question about compensation, like what percentage of base salary is typically tied to the performance or bonuses, and how often does it happen?
Yeah, so the bonus is once a year, like for GSK. So like I said, it's somewhere between like 18 to 25%. I think as you get promoted, the things like bonuses and stock um, tend to be higher. So it tends to outgrow the base salary. So you just tend to have more and more of like performance-based bonuses. And then in terms of how much that bonus varies year to year, it depends on the company, but you know, it's usually not by a huge amount. It's usually by a few percentages in terms of swing. Now a bonus is at the end of the day a bonus, right? So if something horrible happens and oftentimes it's tied to sales targets, right? So um, if the companies was expecting something, and then the drug, let's say, knock on wood, gets withdrawn from the market unexpectedly, and everyone misses their sales targets, you may not even get a bonus, right? So that's the part of the risk of having it as a bonus. But in general, it doesn't change too much year to year, at least for a large pharma company.
Okay. As I'm going for questions, audience are welcome to type if they have more questions, please. And then what advice would you give to someone who is not yet sure about the biotechs but want more exposure before making a decision? Like, is there any practical way for clinicians or scientists to explore the industry before formally transitioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think any experience in how to run a clinical trial, even if it's not industry funded, is extremely helpful. So if there are people doing clinical trials, like uh, you know offering to help with that, sitting in on some of the meetings, the planning meetings and things like that. Um, if you can, if you have the availability to be a sub-I, um, I think those are all really invaluable. And honestly, like if I had more time before joining, I think I would have benefited from that experience because, as I showed, I joined industry pretty quickly after finishing fellowship. But I think like if, I had more experience as a sub-I, or in clinical trials, that would have been certainly helpful.
Okay. Next question is uh, about licensing and credentials. So, like for clinicians working in industry roles, are they required to hold a medical license in the state where the company is located? Or more broadly, like what are the licensing or credential expectations for clinically versus transitioning into non-clinical industry work?
Hmm. Um, that I believe you need to be credentialed. So, for example, if you're a medical monitor, you need to be you need to have a MD or DO and be in good standing. You don't need to be active in practice. Um, I don't know if you need to be licensed in a state level. Um, I'm not sure about that, actually. It's a good
Okay.
question.
Okay. The next question is, how did you obtain the mentorship for this job? Like, did you find it helpful to get another degree aside from the MD?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think that the MSCE, so the Masters in Clinical Epidemiology, was very helpful. So I think tying to the question of what else you can do to, kind of develop a skill set. Um, the Masters in Clinical Epidemiology is kind of like a MPH. So, we got a lot of, but more on, heavily leaning on the epidemiology and stat side. So I think having that training in statistics and really being able to critically evaluate studies and publications was also a very helpful skill set going into industry, right? Because they want people who can evaluate and synthesize and communicate scientific data. It's very important in terms of communicating with regulators and things like that.
Okay, thank you. And then we have some more questions from audience. Is there anything that you miss about academia?
I miss like the camaraderie of being on the wards and seeing people as you kind of round and you know I think that certainly I miss that part of having more kind of a clinical footprint. And at least for me, I'm based out of Boston. Most of my team that I work with is either they're in the UK, they're all around the world. They're in the UK. There's a few people working remotely in the US. and there are some people working in Canada and Poland. And so, it's very different than, my day to day in academics where go in your office and you run into people and, you can sit in the, you um, conferences and things like that. So I do miss that part of it for sure.
Okay.
Um, I look forward to my clinics, um, to just have that patient interaction. Um, I think that's something that I think if I completely did away with, I would really miss as well, is having that kind of like one-on-one, patient interactions. It's something that is very special that, almost no other job has.
Thank you. What has been the most rewarding part of your time at GSK, and what has been the most stressful?
Yeah. Most rewarding is just, I think the impact of, getting medications approved. Um, even when I was starting out, about a year in, I was the medical monitor for a 140 patient healthy volunteer study. But it was the first study that I was on that, we started with writing a protocol and then we started recruiting. Um, and it was just, it was very trippy for me to like get that email to say, oh, we screened and we dosed our first patient. Because to me, that was something that I had never experienced before in terms of like something that was I worked on in paper is now like, resulted in a patient getting an injection, and being enrolled in the trial was very cool. And then, certainly, work being part of the Nucala approval process has been very, 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 very interesting. There is a lot of bureaucracy in the industry. Um, there's a lot of, when I showed you that picture of the Matrix team, yeah, I wasn't exaggerating the number of people who are sometimes involved. And so it can be, it's both a blessing and a curse, where, if you were working on a paper on your own or your grant, you could just have a quick meeting. Maybe it's just you and your mentor, and you say, okay, let's do XYZ. All right, done. Good. That might be, two meetings with 15 different people and, getting somebody, senior leaders approval to do sometimes. And so it can certainly be frustrating to try to work through things that seem relatively simple and end up becoming very, very challenging and very time consuming.
Thank you for sharing. And then another question is about the process of returning to clinical practice after time in industry. Like, what does that typically look like? Would someone need re-credential or recertification on procedures? And how feasible is to maintain or restore clinical activity after a period of?
Yeah, I think that's a very personal, this, I think that's sort of, um, specific to what type of practice you want to return to. Um, yeah, I did find because of this, lapse, I actually let my Massachusetts medical license lapse, and that was a very bad idea because it turned a moderate amount of paperwork to a very large amount of paperwork to get that reinstated. Um, but I recognize this is the critical care assembly, right? And one of the reasons I actively decided two things in terms of clinical care. I decided, my passion was and still is pulmonary hypertension, actually. I decided it wasn't appropriate for me to see PH patients, even when I returned to clinical care, because these patients, they're so sick, they're acutely ill, they need a lot of attention, and I just felt like I wasn't in a position to deliver the best care that I felt like, I would be able to. Um, And then the other thing I decided was I wasn't going to do any kind of like ICU moonlighting, because I felt that with the amount of time that I could devote to clinical care, um, I felt like I was going to get rusty in terms of, the procedural skills and kind of handling emergencies. So I think definitely you have to be realistic about, your confidence and your skill set. I certainly imagine that if I were to return to full clinical practice, I would want to do some, you know, um, refreshers, particularly with the procedural things, because I haven't done it in, you know, 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have one last question. It's about procedural fields, like is there for physicians involved in interventional or procedural specialties, is there any opportunities exist in terms of research or clinical development?
Uh, to merge the two or to kind of
Like, is
continue
there
to do your
like any research opportunities for them or for intervention like GI interventions
Mhm. Um,
or clinical development in their career, like kind of uh um
Oh,
transitioning from, yeah,
like device development, maybe?
yeah.
okay, got it, got it. Yeah, so that would be more typically in the realm of device development, and usually I think, you know, what I find most people will do is, right, they won't be like an employee of, and they'll work with industry sponsors for certain device studies, right? So that can include, being the investigator, right? Being the person who recruits patients and does the procedure, um, all the way to helping them with designing the trial and some of the earlier, planning process of that. And that would kind of typically depend on somebody's level of seniority and their prior experiences. Um, but I don't think generally you would then be hired by the company. It would be more of like you would be consulting um in, in general, because you would still want to keep that clinical footprint to be able to see
Mhm.
patients and recruit patients.
All right. Thank you so much. With that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up the today's session.
Thank you so much for your time. We all learned so much. We'll have this recording out and available. It'll come to you through the email so you can share with all the fellows that you get to work with in the clinic that keep asking you about all of this, and we can share with everybody else. We're so excited. Thanks for sharing your knowledge.
Absolutely. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. De La Cruz, for the opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Mann.